Hey, what's going on everybody? It's Mr. White coming to you from my classroom for part 4 of your spring semester final exam review. So please go ahead and get out your final exam test review paper, and you know the drill by now. This is part 4. I think you've been through this already, but you're going to need to follow along, fill in the answers as we go, and make sure that you study these. If you don't study them, they're not going to help you, right? So, last time we were talking about economic and social revolution, so now we're on World War I. So we're going to pick up on number 49 of your final exam test review. And here we go. What event sparked the beginning of World War I? Well, that was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. You might remember he was assassinated by a Serbian named Gavrilo Princip. And so that was what started World War I. Okay? Number 50. What was the goal of President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points? You may remember that Woodrow Wilson was President of the United States. He was very interested in maintaining peace. So the main purpose of the 14 points was to prevent the outbreak of more wars in the future. All right, number 51. Which of the 4 main causes of World War I most preserved the balance of power among the European countries? That was the alliances. The alliances preserved the power. You may remember that countries like Britain and Russia and France all worked together to form something called the Triple Entente, which made all of them stronger and they thought more secure. For the other countries of Europe, they formed something called the Triple Alliance, and that was countries like Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Okay? So number 52, what happened to Germany with the Treaty of Versailles, and how did Germany feel about that? Well, Germany had to do a lot of different things as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. First of all, they had to admit guilt for starting World War I. That was kind of a big embarrassment to the people of Germany because they didn't feel like it was really their fault. You may remember that it was actually Austria who was the first one to declare war. The other thing was, since they were supposed to be responsible for starting the war, it meant that Germany had to pay reparations to the Allies. In case you forgot what reparations means, that's money that you have to pay because you did something wrong. They also had to surrender territory, and by they I'm talking about the Germans. The Germans gave up all their colonies and even some of their land in Europe. They also had to limit the size of their military. Before World War I, Germany had the largest army in all of Europe, but after World War I, they were reduced to the smallest army in all of Europe. And last of all, Germany was left feeling really angry and bitter. That was the result of all of these restrictions and punishments placed upon Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. All right, number 53. What caused the stalemate on the Western Front in Europe? That was because there was brand new weapons that were being employed for the first time in World War I. Things like machine guns, heavy artillery, airplanes, tanks, submarines, you name it. And so that led to nobody really being able to take the initiative and start winning the war. That's what we mean by a stalemate, like nobody was winning. And because of all these terrible new weapons, the armies of Europe had to resort to something called trench warfare. And trench warfare really slowed things down and kept the armies essentially where they were from the beginning of the war for about 4 years. And so that's why nobody really ended up winning until the very end when America came in and tipped the scales in favor of the Allies. All right, so number 54. Which countries made up the Triple Entente? And which ones made up the Triple Alliance? Well, the Triple Entente, it sounds kind of French, so that's how you can remember France was a part of it. In addition to France, the Triple Entente also had Britain and Russia. So those 3 countries had an alliance together to protect each other. The other one was called the Triple Alliance, and like I said a few minutes ago, that was a partnership between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Okay, so make sure you remember those. There's going to be a question about those. Number 55. Which countries were on the winning side of World War I, and which countries were on the losing side of World War I? It's pretty simple. The winning countries were Britain, France, and the USA. The losing countries were, of course, Germany, as well as Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Once again, you're going to need to remember those countries because you will be asked to identify them on the test. All right, so number 56. Why did Vladimir Lenin promise the Russians peace, land, and bread? The reason why was because he wanted to gain popular support of the people in order to overthrow the Tsar. In case you forgot, the Tsar was the king of Russia. All right, so number 57. What did the machine gun allow soldiers to do in war? Well, the machine gun made it easy to kill a large number of enemies very rapidly from a long distance with great accuracy. So this made World War I one of the most deadly wars in human history because nobody had ever seen a weapon like that before. The machine gun really changed the face of warfare in the 20th century. All right, so number 58. Which country started World War I by declaring war on and invading Serbia? Well, we've said it a couple times now. Remember that was Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary's heir to the throne, the guy who was going to be next to be king, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Serbian rebel named Gavrilo Princip. And that was the spark that started World War I. All right, so number 59. Which front had some of the heaviest fighting during World War I? And which country is this front located? The Western Front was the place that had the heaviest fighting. That's what it was called, the Western Front. And the Western Front was located primarily in France. So that was where most of the fighting of World War I took place, on the Western Front in France. Now, you need to know where France is. To be honest, you need to know where all these countries are. So take a quick look at this map of Europe during World War I. Okay, so now you've seen the map of Europe during World War I. Please, please, please remember where those countries are. It's going to be very important that you can identify those countries on a map because there will be questions asking you to identify the countries on a map. All right, moving on, number 60. What are the four main causes of World War I, and what does each letter mean? You may remember that we gave you a cool little acronym, MAIN, to help you remember the main causes of World War I. So the M in MAIN stands for militarism. Militarism is when a country spends a lot of time and money building up their army. So if you put all your money into getting more soldiers and more weapons, that's militarism. Alliances was the A. Like I said, alliances helped preserve the balance of power in Europe, and the countries thought that it would make them safer to have others who would back them up in case of a war. The I was imperialism. Imperialism meant when the European countries went out and tried to conquer other areas to gain more natural resources. This caused a lot of competition between the European countries for different colonies all over the world. And last of all was nationalism. Nationalism is that really strong feeling of love and loyalty for your culture and your people. And nationalism led a lot of European nations to feel like they were the greatest people on earth. And therefore, it would be really easy for them to defeat all their enemies in a war because, naturally, they're so great, right? So those are the four main causes of World War I. So number 61, what was a social impact of World War I? Well, by social we mean something that affects people's lives, something that affects the way that people live together. And during World War I, famine and malnutrition were a huge social problem. So for I guess you could say a negative social effect of World War I, we can say famine and malnutrition. All right, so number 62, describe trench warfare. Well, trench warfare was extremely dirty and dangerous, and I would venture to say it was pretty frightening. Essentially, you had people living outside in what amounted to glorified ditches, just like a ditch dug into the ground. They basically had very little protection from the elements, so when it was cold outside, they all got really cold. When it rained, they all got really wet. There were rats and bugs living in the trenches with the soldiers, and not to mention the fact that it didn't give them very much protection from bullets or bombs. It was relatively easy for bombs to drop right into the trenches and actually kill the soldiers who thought that they were safe. So trench warfare definitely was not a fun thing, and it was something that caused World War I to be a really bloody and dangerous war. All right, so number 63. What were some of the provisions outlined by the Treaty of Versailles? So the Treaty of Versailles had lots of different provisions, but the main ones that you're going to need to know is that number one, it created the League of Nations. In case you forgot what the League of Nations was, it was that club that countries could join after World War I, and the whole purpose was to try to prevent the outbreak of future wars. Remember, it was Woodrow Wilson who came up with the idea for the League of Nations. But you may also remember that the Treaty of Versailles limited the size of Germany's army. It forced Germany to admit guilt for starting World War I. It also forced Germany to give up some of their land, and they had to pay reparations to the Allies. So, all in all, I'd say the Treaty of Versailles was pretty bad, especially if you were German. Alright, so number 64. Which empire committed a genocide against the Armenian people during World War I? The genocide was against the Armenians, and the people who did it were the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire. Today we call them Turkey. You may also remember that Turkey doesn't necessarily agree that this is a genocide. But when you consider that about 1 million people were killed and another 1 million people were displaced from their homes, I'd say it's pretty close to a genocide, right? Alright, number 65. What is total war? And how would propaganda help to encourage people to participate in a total war? Well, total war simply means a conflict where all of a country's resources are utilized to help the war effort. So that means all the food, all the metal, all the cloth, everything is going towards helping the soldiers. This also means that people have to sacrifice certain things in order to help the soldiers. So the propaganda would encourage people to give up things that they might want in order to help the soldiers to be successful in war. Here's a really good example of one of those propaganda posters. Okay, now you've seen the propaganda posters. If you see something that looks like that on the test, you should be thinking about total war and how total war causes people to have to make sacrifices to help the soldiers. Alright, moving right along. What is national self-determination according to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points? Well, national self-determination means that all people have a right to live in a country run by a government that represents the interests and the will of the majority of the people who live in that country. So for example, if you're German and you want to live in a country full of Germans that's run by Germans, that takes care of German people, you have the right to do that because that is your nation's self-determination, meaning that your people can determine how to live their own lives. Okay? So, and it's worth noting that that's pretty anti-colonial, because during the time of colonies, the Europeans were deciding how people lived their lives and they were running other people's countries. So after World War I, we started seeing a lot of these colonies disappearing because of national self-determination. Alright, anyways, moving on. Number 67. What were the reasons for America joining the Allied powers in World War I? There were several different reasons. For one thing, there was that letter called the Zimmermann Telegram, which was a letter from the Chancellor of Germany to Mexico, basically asking Mexico to attack the U.S. in order to help Germany. Another thing was that the Germans had sunk a boat called the Lusitania, which had many Americans on board. The reason why this happened was because the Germans were participating in something known as unrestricted submarine warfare, where they basically reserved the right to sink any ship that they thought could be helping the British or any of their enemies during World War I. And last of all, the United States had strong cultural ties to Great Britain. We speak the same language, we have the same religion, we have a shared history, and so we had stronger connections with Britain, and that was why we joined their side during World War I. Okay guys, that's it for part 4. That means there's only 2 more parts of this final exam test review to go before you are ready to rock and roll and make a great grade on this test. So, as always, you gotta study, you gotta watch the rest of these videos, and please, please, please get a good night's sleep and prepare yourself before this test. Don't show up with no pencil, don't show up saying, oh, we got a test today. You should know we have a test because it's the final, alright? So, good luck guys, see you at the final.